You can learn everything about a person by watching what they do when they think nobody matters. The rain tapped softly against the train windows as the midnight line pulled away from Boston Station, carrying businessmen, exhausted travelers, and people running from lives they no longer recognized. In the private lounge car, Julian Mercer leaned back into the leather seat of cabin 12 and closed his eyes. To anyone passing by, he looked asleep. Just another tired passenger in an expensive charcoal coat, with a silver watch glinting beneath the dim overhead lights. But Julian wasn't sleeping. Not even close. 3 days earlier, the billionaire founder of Mercer Capital had discovered that his fiancée and his chief financial officer had been secretly moving money behind his back for nearly a year. The headlines hadn't broken yet. They would soon. But tonight, for the first time in over a decade, Julian didn't want assistants, security teams, or penthouse silence. He wanted distance. So he boarded a midnight train to New York under a different name and decided to do something he hadn't done in years. Watch people. The train swayed gently through the storm while soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers overhead. Somewhere farther down the car, silverware clinked against china. Coffee steamed into the cold air. And then he heard her voice. "Careful, sweetheart. That cup's still hot." Julian kept his eyes shut, but listened closely. Her footsteps were light, calm, unhurried. Not the rushed, clicking heels of someone trying to survive a double shift. There was patience in the way she moved. He cracked one eye open slightly. Blonde hair tied loosely behind her neck. Pale blue uniform. Simple silver necklace. No makeup beyond what exhaustion allowed. The name stitched above her pocket read Elena. She crouched beside a little girl whose hands trembled while holding a paper cup of cocoa. The child's mother looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," the woman whispered quietly. She dropped the first one. Elena smiled softly. "Then we'll just call this the refill policy." She handed over another cup without charging her. The mother blinked in surprise. "Thank you." Elena only nodded and walked away before gratitude could become uncomfortable. Julian watched her move through the aisle with the quiet precision of someone used to carrying invisible weight. A businessman snapped his fingers for more coffee without looking at her face. Elena poured it anyway. An older man complained the soup was cold. She warmed it herself instead of arguing. Nobody thanked her. Nobody noticed her. But she noticed everyone. 20 minutes later, the train slowed near a small station in Connecticut. Wind rattled the windows as passengers shifted impatiently in their seats. Elena stepped off briefly onto the platform, carrying a paper bag Julian hadn't seen before. At the edge of the station sat an elderly homeless man beneath the flickering light of a vending machine. His coat looked too thin for 38-degree weather. Elena handed him the bag quietly. "Sandwich. Apple. Coffee." The man looked stunned. "Miss, I can't pay you." "I know," she replied gently. "That's why it matters." Julian stared at her through the rain-speckled glass. No cameras. No social media. No audience applauding her kindness. Just a tired waitress in the middle of the night giving away food she probably needed herself. Something uncomfortable tightened in his chest. Because for the first time in years, he realized he had no idea what genuine kindness looked like anymore. The train pushed deeper into the storm while most passengers settled into silence, their reflections flickering against the dark windows like ghosts passing through another life. Julian Mercer remained motionless in cabin 12, one hand resting near the untouched espresso beside him. Every few minutes, Elena crossed the lounge car carrying fresh coffee, folded blankets, or quiet patience for people too distracted to notice her exhaustion. It fascinated him. She moved like someone who had learned long ago that no one was coming to rescue her, so she became gentle anyway. Around 1:30 in the morning, the train lights flickered once. A collective sigh rolled through the cabin. Phones lifted instantly. Complaints followed. "Great. Just what we need. Does this train even have backup power? I paid $300 for this seat." Elena stayed calm. "The generator will stabilize in a moment, sir." Her voice never rose. Never cracked. Julian noticed something else too. She never defended herself when people were rude. She simply absorbed the frustration and kept moving forward. Like rain against stone. A few seats away, a young man in a wrinkled blue hoodie sat staring at a laptop covered in engineering stickers. His hands shook slightly as he refreshed his email over and over again. Elena slowed beside him. "You okay?" The young man forced a laugh. I missed my final interview in Boston because of the storm. Job interview. Medical school. He rubbed his eyes. I worked 3 jobs to get there too. Elena glanced toward the dining counter, then disappeared briefly into the service car. When she returned, she placed a slice of warm pecan pie beside him. On the house. I cannot pay for this. Good thing I did not ask you to. The young man smiled for the first time all night. Julian looked away slowly, unsettled by how natural her kindness seemed. Most wealthy people he knew turned generosity into performance. Charity dinners, cameras, press releases. Elena did it quietly, like breathing. Then came the moment that changed something inside him. A sharply dressed man in a navy suit stormed into the lounge car, speaking loudly on his phone. I do not care what legal says. Delay the merger until Monday. He stopped suddenly near Elena and frowned at the coffee stain on his sleeve. Unbelievable. This train service is a disaster. Elena looked down. I am sorry, sir. Let me help with that. Just forget it. He rolled his eyes. People like you always make things worse. The words landed heavily in the silence. Several passengers looked uncomfortable. Elena simply nodded once and stepped back. But Julian saw it. Just for a second. The tiny pause in her breathing. The way her fingers tightened around the coffee tray before relaxing again. She carried the insult away, quietly like she had carried hundreds before it. Julian stared at the man with growing disgust. 3 months ago, he might have said the same thing without thinking twice. That realization sat heavier than the rain pounding against the windows. 30 minutes later, the businessman fell asleep in his seat near the fireplace lounge. His phone slipped from his lap onto the carpet unnoticed. Elena spotted it while collecting empty cups. She picked it up carefully, glanced at the cracked family photo on the lock screen, then tucked the phone safely into the man's coat pocket before covering him with an extra blanket. No bitterness. No revenge. Just grace. Julian slowly exhaled into the darkness. He had spent years building companies worth billions of dollars. But watching Elena Hartwell move through that train with nothing except kindness and quiet dignity, he began to suspect she possessed something far rarer than wealth. By 2 in the morning, the storm outside had become relentless. Rain hammered the train roof in uneven waves while distant thunder rolled across the dark countryside like a warning no one could fully hear. Most passengers had drifted into restless sleep beneath dim amber lights. But Julian Mercer remained awake in the corner of cabin 12, quietly watching Elena Hartwell move through the silence like she belonged to another world entirely. The strange part was not her kindness anymore. It was her composure. Every movement she made carried the calm precision of someone who had once lived a very different life. She stacked porcelain cups perfectly without looking, folded linen napkins with exact corners. Even the way she spoke felt measured, thoughtful, almost elegant beneath the exhaustion in her voice. Julian had spent his entire adult life studying people. Investors, politicians, competitors, liars. He knew how to read ambition within seconds. But Elena confused him. Nothing about her matched the uniform she wore. Around 2:15, the train hit a rough patch of track, causing several passengers to wake suddenly. A crystal water glass tipped from one of the lounge tables and shattered across the floor near the fireplace area. The sharp sound echoed through the cabin. Elena moved instantly. Everybody stay seated, please. Her voice remained soft but steady. She knelt carefully, gathering the broken glass one piece at a time while an older passenger nearby apologized repeatedly. I am so sorry. My hand slipped. It is okay, Elena assured him gently. Nobody got hurt. That is what matters. Julian noticed the older man struggling to breathe slightly as he bent forward in embarrassment. Before anyone else reacted, Elena quietly reached into her apron pocket and handed him a small peppermint candy. Slow breaths, she whispered. In through your nose. You are all right. The man nodded after a moment, his breathing easing little by little. Julian frowned slightly. That was not random kindness. That was experience. Training. She recognized panic before anyone else did. Later, while Elena carried the broken glass tray toward the service car, one of the younger employees stopped her near the doorway. You should have become a doctor instead of wasting your life on trains. Elena gave a tired smile. Life does not always ask what we wanted. Still, the employee laughed softly. You know more medical stuff than half the nurses I know. Elena's smile faded for only a second. I used to study a lot of things. She disappeared behind the kitchen door before more questions could follow. Julian stared after her carefully. Doctor, nurse, teacher, musician. He could not tell anymore. All he knew was that Elena Hartwell carried herself like someone who had lost something important without allowing the loss to make her cruel. The train slowed unexpectedly near another station just outside New Haven. An announcement crackled overhead explaining there would be a 20-minute delay due to flooding near the tracks ahead. Groans filled the cabin again. Elena immediately began offering fresh coffee and blankets before anyone even asked. Julian watched as she approached a teenage boy sitting alone near the rear window. Headphones covered his ears, but tears slipped quietly down his face while he stared outside at the storm. Most people ignored him. Elena did not. She sat beside him for less than 30 seconds. Julian could not hear everything she said, only the final sentence before she stood up again. You do not have to know what your future looks like tonight, she told him softly. You just have to survive. This evening first. The boy wiped his eyes quickly and nodded. And somehow, hearing those words in the quiet glow of that rain-soaked train unsettled Julian more than every betrayal waiting for him back in Manhattan. The delay stretched past 3 in the morning, and the train no longer felt like transportation. It felt like a floating world suspended somewhere between exhaustion and confession. Outside, rain blurred the stations into streaks of silver and shadow. Inside, the warm amber lights softened tired faces and quiet regrets. Julian Mercer sat alone near the window with his untouched espresso growing cold beside him, while Elena Hartwell moved steadily through the cabin like the only thing keeping the night from falling apart completely. He had stopped pretending to sleep an hour ago. Now he simply watched without understanding why he could not look away. Every instinct Julian possessed told him there was more to her story than she allowed people to see. He noticed small things others missed. The faint white indentation on her left ring finger where a piano callus used to rest. The way she instinctively organized objects symmetrically whenever passengers left tables messy. The fact that she pronounced certain words with the polished clarity of someone highly educated trying very hard not to sound educated anymore. Nothing about Elena matched the life she appeared to live. Near the rear lounge, a wealthy couple argued quietly over financial documents spread across their table. The husband rubbed his temples while his wife stared anxiously at a calculator on her phone. The numbers still do not work, she whispered. We are short almost $80,000. Elena approached carefully with fresh tea. Would you like more hot water? The husband sighed heavily. At this point we need a miracle, not tea. Elena gave a sympathetic smile and began turning away, but her eyes briefly landed on the papers scattered across the table. Julian saw her pause, just for a second. Then she spoke carefully. I am sorry. I did not mean to overhear. The husband waved tiredly. It is fine. Elena hesitated. Your interest rate projection is based on quarterly compounding. The couple blinked in confusion. Elena pointed softly toward the calculator. If the refinancing switches to monthly adjustment after year 3, your repayment schedule changes completely. Silence. The husband stared down at the screen and recalculated quickly. His eyes widened. Wait. He punched the numbers again. Linda, she is right. His wife covered her mouth slowly. That cuts almost $90,000 off the total. Both of them looked up at Elena in disbelief. How did you? Elena immediately stepped back. I am sorry. I should not have interrupted. No, the husband said quickly. Please wait. But she was already walking away with the empty tea tray held tightly against her chest. Julian stared after her, stunned. That was not luck. That was advanced financial knowledge delivered in less than 10 seconds. The kind of insight executives paid consultants 6 figures to provide. And somehow it came from a waitress working overnight trains during a thunderstorm. A few minutes later, Julian quietly stood and followed her toward the service car for the first time all night. The narrow hallway smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked wool coats. Elena stood alone near the counter, organizing receipts beneath the dim kitchen light. She looked smaller there somehow, more tired. Julian noticed her hands trembling slightly once she thought nobody could see her anymore. You studied finance? He asked suddenly. Elena froze. Slowly, she turned toward him. Her expression remained polite, but guarded now. I am sorry, sir. Were you speaking to me? Julian slipped his hands into his coat pockets. You corrected a restructuring model in under 5 seconds. Elena looked down at the receipts in silence. Rain tapped softly against the metal walls around them. Finally, she answered in a quiet voice. People can learn many things before life changes its mind. Julian held her gaze longer than he intended. And for the first time that night, Elena Hartwell looked directly back at him without lowering her eyes. Elena held his gaze for only a moment before looking back down at the receipts in her hands. You should try to get some rest, sir, she said quietly. We still have a long ride ahead. Julian almost smiled at that. Nobody spoke to him like that anymore. Not employees, not investors, not even friends. Most people either feared him or wanted something from him. Elena seemed to want neither. You recognized the numbers instantly, he said calmly. That is not normal. Neither is a billionaire riding a midnight train alone during a thunderstorm. Julian blinked once. Elena continued organizing the receipts without looking up again. Your watch gave you away. She nodded lightly toward the silver Patek Philippe on his wrist. Only 300 were ever made. For the first time all night, Julian felt something close to surprise. So you do know who I am. Elena finally met his eyes again. Everybody in finance knows who you are, Mr. Mercer. The way she said his name carried no excitement, no nervousness, just recognition. Somehow that unsettled him more than admiration would have. Then why pretend not to notice? Elena folded the final receipt carefully before answering. Because being important must get exhausting. The words landed softly between them. Not rude, not flattering, just true. Somewhere farther down the train, thunder rolled across the tracks again. The lights flickered briefly overhead before stabilizing. Elena rubbed her temple for half a second, and Julian caught the exhaustion she had been hiding beneath professionalism all night. How long have you been working, he asked. Since noon yesterday. That is almost 16 hours. 17 now. She said it casually, like fatigue had become part of her personality. Julian frowned slightly. And after this? Another shift tomorrow evening. That is insane. Elena gave a faint smile. Most survival stories are. Before Julian could respond, a loud cough echoed from the rear cabin. Both of them turned instantly. The older man Elena had helped earlier was struggling again, his breathing shallow while his wife looked panicked beside him. Elena moved before anyone else could react. Fast, controlled, certain. Julian followed several steps behind as she knelt beside the man and gently steadied his shoulders. Look at me, Mr. Donnelly. Her voice remained calm despite the rising tension nearby. Slow breaths. You are safe. My chest, the man whispered weakly. Elena glanced toward his wife. Does he carry nitroglycerin? The woman nodded frantically and reached into her purse. Elena helped the man sit upright while speaking steadily the entire time. Good. That is good. Keep breathing with me. Julian watched in stunned silence. There was nothing uncertain about her movements now. No hesitation. No panic. She knew exactly what she was doing. Within minutes, the older man's breathing eased slightly. The color slowly returned to his face. Passengers nearby exhaled in relief. Elena stayed beside him until his hands stopped shaking. Then she quietly pulled the blanket higher over his shoulders. You should still see a doctor when we arrive in New York, she told him softly. But you are all right for now. The wife burst into tears. Thank you. Oh my God, thank you. Elena only squeezed her hand gently before standing. Julian noticed every passenger watching her now. Some with gratitude, some with confusion. Because waitresses were not supposed to know how to respond to medical distress with that level of calm precision. Elena returned toward the service car without seeking attention, but Julian stopped her halfway down the aisle. You were not just studying finance, he said quietly. Elena looked tired suddenly. Truly tired. No, she admitted after a long silence. I was studying medicine too. Julian stared at her beneath the dim train lights while rain streaked across the windows behind them. And for the first time in years, the billionaire who trusted no one found himself wanting to know everything about a woman who clearly had every reason to stop believing in the world. The train finally crossed into New York State a little after 4 in the morning. Outside the windows, the storm had softened into cold mist drifting across abandoned platforms and sleeping towns. Inside the lounge car, exhaustion settled over the passengers like a heavy blanket. Conversations faded. Coffee cooled untouched on tables. Only the soft hum of the tracks remained constant beneath the amber lights. Elena Hartwell stood near, The service counter pouring fresh coffee into paper cups for the night crew, while Julian Mercer watched her from across the cabin with growing confusion he could no longer ignore. She should not have existed in his world. Not like this. Not after everything he had seen tonight. People with her intelligence usually chased power, money, prestige. They did not spend 17-hour shifts serving strangers who barely looked them in the eye. Yet Elena moved through the train with a kind of quiet dignity that made everyone else seem smaller by comparison. Julian had spent years believing success revealed character. But tonight he was beginning to wonder if comfort simply hid it. Elena carried 2 fresh cups toward the front cabin when a sudden jolt shook the train hard enough to rattle the windows. Several passengers gasped awake. One suitcase slid from an overhead rack and hit the aisle with a loud crash. Elena steadied herself instantly, one hand catching the nearby table before the coffee spilled. "Everybody stay seated, please," she called calmly. Her voice cut through the confusion without needing volume. A little girl near the window began crying in panic while her mother tried unsuccessfully to calm her down. Elena walked over immediately and crouched beside her seat. "Hey," she whispered softly. "Do you know what my grandmother used to tell me during storms?" The little girl shook her head through tears. Elena smiled gently. "Trains are like people. They shake sometimes. But that does not mean they stop moving forward." The child slowly quieted while Julian stared at Elena in silence. She always knew exactly what people needed. Not impressive words. Not dramatic gestures. Just comfort that felt real. A few minutes later, the conductor entered the lounge car looking tense. "We may have another delay ahead," he announced. Flooding near the Hudson crossing. Groans spread through the cabin again. One businessman cursed under his breath while checking his watch for the 10th time. Julian barely noticed any of it. His attention stayed fixed on Elena as she quietly distributed blankets to passengers preparing for another wait. Then something unexpected happened. An older woman near the fireplace lounge suddenly looked at Elena more carefully and froze. "Wait," she whispered. Elena paused politely. "Yes, ma'am." The woman sat forward slowly, studying her face beneath the dim train lights. "Hartwell." Elena's expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, just a tiny stillness behind her eyes. "I am sorry. You are Richard Hartwell's daughter, aren't you?" Silence spread quietly around the nearby seats. Julian frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. The woman pressed a trembling hand against her chest. "Oh my goodness." She looked almost emotional now. "Your father performed surgery on my husband 12 years ago in Chicago." Julian's eyes narrowed immediately. "Surgery." Elena stood completely, still holding the stack of blankets against her chest. "You must have me confused with someone else," she said softly. But the woman shook her head firmly. "No. Richard Hartwell was one of the best cardiac surgeons in the country." She stared at Elena with disbelief. "I remember seeing your picture in a magazine article once. You were accepted into Johns Hopkins at 19. The cabin went silent. Even the businessman complaining earlier lowered his phone slowly. Julian looked at Elena carefully as color drained from her face beneath the warm train lights. And suddenly the mystery surrounding her no longer felt small. It felt enormous. For a moment, nobody in the lounge car moved. The train continued rumbling through the mist outside, but inside cabin 12, silence settled heavily between strangers who suddenly realized the quiet waitress carrying coffee through the aisles was not who they thought she was. Elena Hartwell stood frozen beside the fireplace lounge, blankets still folded carefully in her arms. The older woman looked at her with growing certainty. "Your father saved my husband after every other surgeon refused the case," she said softly. "Richard Hartwell was famous in Chicago." Elena lowered her eyes immediately. That was a long time ago. Her voice had changed. Softer now, guarded in a different way. Julian Mercer watched her carefully from across the cabin. "Famous. Johns Hopkins. Cardiac surgeon." The pieces no longer confused him. They disturbed him, because none of this matched the life she was living now. The older woman smiled gently. "You wanted to become a surgeon too, did you not?" Elena swallowed quietly. "I used to." "You were brilliant." The woman's eyes filled with sympathy. "I remember the article saying you graduated college at 19. A businessman nearby looked up from his phone in disbelief. Another passenger whispered something under his breath. Elena shifted uncomfortably beneath the sudden attention. Julian noticed it instantly. She did not enjoy admiration. In fact, She looked trapped by it. "Excuse me," Elena said softly. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the service car before anyone could stop her. Julian hesitated only briefly before following her again. He found her standing alone beside the stainless steel counter near the kitchen entrance, one hand gripping the edge hard enough for her knuckles to pale beneath the fluorescent lights. The train hummed softly around them. Elena stared down at the sink without speaking. "You lied," Julian said carefully. Elena let out a tired breath. "No," she looked up slowly. "I just stopped explaining myself." Rainwater streaked across the small window behind her, while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the tracks. Julian crossed his arms loosely. "You were accepted into Johns Hopkins at 19. "Yes. Your father was one of the top cardiac surgeons in the country." Elena nodded once. "And now you work overnight train shifts 17 hours at a time." Her lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Life has range." Julian studied her face carefully. She looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically, emotionally, like someone who had spent years carrying a story too painful to retell. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Elena looked away toward the dark window. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then finally, very softly, "My father died during my second year of medical school." Julian remained silent. Elena continued folding napkins mechanically while she spoke. "After that, my mother got sick. My younger brother was 14. My sister was 9. Her hand slowed slightly. Tuition disappeared fast." "Scholarships?" Julian asked. Elena gave a faint shake of her head. "Scholarships cover classes. They do not cover funeral bills, or chemotherapy, or mortgage payments." The fluorescent light above them flickered softly once. Julian felt something heavy settle inside his chest. Because she was not angry while saying any of it. That was the part he could not understand. Most people became bitter after losing less than that. Elena simply sounded tired. "So you left school," he said quietly. "I postponed it." She corrected him gently. At first, her eyes drifted toward the floor. Then time kept moving. Somewhere down the hallway, another employee laughed loudly at a joke from the kitchen crew. The normal sound felt strangely distant. Julian looked at Elena standing there in a pale blue uniform carrying invisible grief with perfect posture, and suddenly the entire world he came from felt embarrassingly shallow. "You could have asked for help," he said before thinking. Elena looked up at him again. Not offended, just sad somehow. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly. "People admire successful women. They pity struggling ones." She folded the final napkin carefully and placed it onto the counter. And pity is a very lonely kind of attention. Julian had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation. He had spoken in rooms filled with senators and executives who feared disappointing him. But standing there beside that exhausted waitress in the quiet glow of a train kitchen, he found himself completely unable to answer. After that conversation, something shifted quietly between them. Not romance, not comfort, something rarer, recognition. The kind that happens when two people stop performing and finally see each other clearly beneath the roles they wear for the world. The train continued south through the fading storm, while most passengers slept beneath dim reading lights and folded blankets. Outside the windows, dawn still hid beyond the horizon, but the darkness no longer felt endless. Julian Mercer returned to his seat near the lounge car. Yet for the first time in years, his thoughts were not consumed by stock prices, board meetings, or damage control waiting for him back in Manhattan. They stayed fixed on Elena Hartwell, on the way she carried disappointment without becoming cruel, on the impossible grace of someone who had every reason to resent the world and somehow chose kindness instead. He realized something uncomfortable then. He had spent most of his adult life rewarding confidence while overlooking quiet strength completely. An hour later, the train finally resumed full speed after the flooding delay cleared near the Hudson crossing. Passengers slowly woke again as the first pale traces of morning appeared beyond the rain-covered glass. Elena continued working despite the exhaustion now visible beneath her eyes. Julian noticed the tiny details others missed. The slight stiffness in her shoulders every time she lifted a tray. The way she paused briefly whenever she thought nobody was looking. She was running on determination alone now. Near 5:30, a wealthy man in an expensive gray coat entered the lounge car, speaking loudly into his phone about a delayed investment conference downtown. He stopped abruptly when he recognized Julian sitting alone by the window. His entire posture changed instantly. Mr. Mercer? Several nearby passengers looked up at the name. The man hurried forward with sudden excitement. I knew that was you. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Elena glanced over from the coffee station, but said nothing. I attended your keynote at the Manhattan Economic Summit last year. The man continued eagerly. Incredible presentation. Julian offered a polite nod. He could already feel it happening. The shift. Passengers whispering quietly now. People glancing toward him differently. Curious. Calculating. Within minutes, the atmosphere inside the cabin transformed. The businessman who had complained earlier suddenly smiled too much when passing by. Another passenger loudly mentioned venture capital while pretending not to stare. Even the conductor became noticeably more formal while checking tickets. Julian hated it immediately, because after watching Elena all night, the performance felt impossible to ignore now. Then he noticed something else. Elena treated him exactly the same. She walked over calmly holding a fresh cup of coffee. You never drank the first one, she said softly. No nervousness. No sudden admiration. No attempt to impress him now that everyone knew who he was. Julian looked up at her quietly. You are not surprised. Elena placed the cup carefully onto the table. Should I be? Most people are. A faint smile touched her lips. Most people see your money before they see you. The words settled deeply into him. Julian looked down at the steam rising from the coffee between them. Nobody had spoken to him this honestly in years. And what do you see? He asked before he could stop himself. Elena considered the question carefully. Through the nearby windows, faint silver morning light finally began breaking through the storm clouds. Honestly, she asked softly. Julian nodded once. Elena looked at him steadily. I think you are a man who became successful so nobody could ever disappoint you again. Silence. Deep and immediate. The sounds of the train faded around him for a moment. Julian stared at her, stunned not because she insulted him, but because she was right. Completely right. Elena lowered her eyes gently afterward, as if she regretted saying too much. But Julian could not look away anymore. Because somewhere during this long rain-soaked night between Boston and New York, the billionaire who trusted no one had met the first person who saw through him completely, without asking for anything in return. By the time the train finally approached Manhattan, dawn had begun unfolding slowly across the skyline like a promise the night could not stop. The storm was gone now. In its place came pale silver light reflecting against skyscraper windows and wet train tracks stretching endlessly toward the city. Inside the lounge car, passengers gathered their coats, checked their phones, and returned to the lives waiting for them beyond the station. But something inside Julian Mercer had changed somewhere between Boston and New York, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would not step off this train as the same man who boarded it. Elena Hartwell stood near the service counter finishing her final shift duties while the train rolled beneath the Hudson tunnels. Her movements were slower now. Exhaustion lingered beneath her calm expression, no matter how gracefully she carried it. Julian watched her quietly from his seat one last time. The little girl from earlier hugged Elena tightly before leaving with her mother. The medical student thanked her again for the pie she had given him hours ago. Even the businessman who insulted her earlier avoided her eyes while stepping off the train. Elena treated every single person with the same gentle professionalism. No resentment, no bitterness, just quiet dignity all the way to the end. The train finally slowed into Penn Station at exactly 6:12 in the morning. Brakes hissed softly beneath the cabin floor while conductors opened the doors to the crowded platform beyond. Passengers flooded out quickly into the noise and movement of Manhattan waking up. Julian remained seated. Elena noticed. You are going to miss your stop, Mr. Mercer. Her voice carried the faintest trace of amusement now. Julian stood slowly, slipping his coat over his shoulders. I think I already arrived where I needed to. Elena looked down briefly, almost embarrassed by the sincerity in his voice. For a second, neither of them moved while the station noise echoed outside around them. Then Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small cream-colored business card. He placed it gently onto the table beside her coffee tray. If you ever want to go back, he said quietly, call me. Elena frowned slightly. Back where? Medical school. Silence. Deep and immediate. Elena stared at the card without touching it. Mr. Mercer. No charity, he interrupted softly. No pity. His eyes held her steadily now. An investment. Elena swallowed hard. And for the first time all night, Julian saw emotion break through the composure she fought so carefully to maintain. "You do not even know me," she whispered. Julian gave the smallest shake of his head. "No," he looked around the now empty train car. "But I watched what you did when nobody thought you mattered." Elena lowered her eyes quickly as tears threatened for the first time that night. She looked almost frustrated by them. Julian understood that feeling more than she realized. Before stepping toward the train door, he paused beside her one final time. "You were wrong about something," he said quietly. Elena looked up. "What?" Morning light spilled through the station windows behind him, soft against the silver edges of the city skyline. Julian's voice softened. "You said successful women get admired while struggling women get pitted." He glanced toward the coffee-stained tables, the folded blankets, the exhausted passengers she cared for all night long. Then back at her. "I think truly strong women just get remembered." Elena stood speechless as Julian stepped off the train and disappeared into the moving crowd of Manhattan. For several seconds, she remained completely still beside the empty lounge car while the city roared awake outside. Then slowly, almost afraid to believe it was real, she looked down at the business card resting beside her tray. Beneath Julian Mercer's private number, one sentence had been written carefully in black ink sometime during the night. "The world did not change its mind about you. Life simply interrupted your introduction."